Bermuda Triangle. The Bermuda Triangle is the most deadly place on Earth, if you believe newspaper headlines, and one of the most popular tourist destinations, if you believe airline tickets. One corner of this sinister triangle is Miami, Florida, where a then businessman named Donald Trump had a vacation home and a nearby golf course. Inside the triangle lie the Bahamas, an archipelago where hundreds of thousands of people fly every year to sunbathe, drink cocktails, and swim with dolphins. Two fully sovereign nations, 500,000 permanent residents, cruise ships the size of floating cities. And yet, we keep calling this patch of ocean one of the most terrifying places on the planet. How did it come to this? That paradox is where everything begins. I want you to hold 3 questions in your mind. First, how did 5 American military aircraft, flown by experienced pilots, dissolve into thin air on a clear December day? And how did the official investigation fail to adequately explain what happened? Second, who was Charles Berlitz? And how did one man with an extraordinary biography and a fevered imagination convinced 20 million buyers around the world that Atlanteans were sitting on the ocean floor stealing ships? And third, the most unexpected question: why did a quiet librarian from Arizona accomplish what the entire scientific world could not? And what does a Vladimir Vysotsky song, once heard out of tune, have to do with it? These 3 threads will converge at the end. But first, let's look at the stage. I want you to picture a map. The southeastern coast of the United States, Florida reaching its fingers into the sea. Slightly to the east, the chain of the Bahama Islands, further out in the ocean, the solitary archipelago of Bermuda, and to the south, the island of Puerto Rico. Connect these 4 points, and you get the shape commonly known as the Bermuda Triangle. The only problem is that no one actually knows where its borders are. Every researcher drew them to suit their own purposes. If you need to include more disappearances in the zone of anomaly, the triangle expands eastward, grabbing a chunk of the Atlantic. If you want more drama, the southern border shifts toward Cuba. The area varies from source to source, anywhere from 1.3 million to 4 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, the entire European Union covers roughly 4+ million square kilometers. That means, according to the most generous cartographers, the mysterious anomaly occupies a space nearly the size of all of Europe. Convenient, isn't it? Lose a plane, and the search zone already equals a continent. But even if you take the most modest classic triangle, you'll find the Sargasso Sea inside it. The only sea in the world with no coastline. It doesn't cut into land the way the Black Sea or the Caribbean do. It sits right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, held in place on all sides by powerful currents. The Gulf Stream, the North Atlantic Current, the Canary Current, and the North Equatorial Current form a giant gyre, not a whirlpool that sucks ships down, but a slow, almost imperceptible, clockwise circulation of water. At the center of this ring, the water is nearly motionless, dead calm, for weeks, for months. And here is the first genuine, unembellished horror of the Bermuda Triangle. The horror that existed long before UFOs and Charles Berlitz. Imagine a Spanish galleon of the 16th century, a sailing ship. It moves only when the wind blows. Such a vessel enters the Sargasso Sea, and the wind disappears completely. The sails go limp. The ship is trapped in dead water, surrounded on all sides by a thick carpet of floating brown sargassum seaweed, hence the name. The seaweed is so dense that, according to sailors' accounts, it covers the water as far as the eye can see and seems as though you could step overboard and walk on it. In reality, you'd sink and drown. But the sight creates an overwhelming sense of a trap. The crew slowly goes mad from thirst and hunger because freshwater supplies are finite and the shore is unreachable. That is where the bad reputation of this region began, long before anyone invented the word anomaly. Speaking of thirst and horses, there is an old maritime term, the horse latitudes. This is what sailors called the belt of calm in these waters. Why horse? Because when a sailing ship was stuck without wind and water started running out, the first things thrown overboard were horses. They were simply cast into the sea to save water for the crew. Brutal, but that was the calculus. And that is the rational, prosaic horror of the sea. Death here was not an anomaly. It was an occupational hazard. Now let's talk about depth. Below the Sargasso Sea, the ocean floor plunges steeply into the North American basin. Average depth, more than 5 kilometers. And off the northern coast of Puerto Rico runs the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point in the Atlantic, 8,380 meters. For comparison, Mount Everest at 8,848 meters, if placed on the bottom of that trench, would be completely submerged, with half a kilometer of ocean still swirling above its peak. Finding the wreckage of a plane or a small vessel at such depths is technically near impossible even today. In the 1940s, utterly out of the question. When something disappeared in this area, it disappeared without a trace, not because aliens took it, but because it fell into an 8-kilometer blackness where pressure crushes steel like foil, and any debris is quickly buried under silt. The setting is established. Now we need victims. The first disappearances in the region were being recorded long before anyone thought to draw a triangle around the zone. In 1800, the mail vessel USS Pickering, sailing from Newcastle, Delaware to the Caribbean, vanished with all hands, presumably lost in a storm. In 1822, a Spanish merchant ship en route from Havana to Spain disappeared. No one cried anomaly. The sea was a dangerous place by default, and sailors blamed losses on weather, reefs, navigational error, and ordinary human stupidity. But gradually, decade by decade, these cases accumulated in the memory of port taverns and newspaper columns. The oldest story most often stitched into Bermuda mythology is, of course, Christopher Columbus. In 1492, during his first voyage, he recorded a strange observation in his ship's log. Sailing at night, somewhere in the vicinity of what we now call the Bermuda Triangle, the admiral and his crew spotted a flickering light on the horizon. Columbus described it as a candle-like glow that rose and fell, as if someone were walking across the waves with a torch. What was it? UFO enthusiasts adore this passage, an extraterrestrial craft, they say. Atlanteans with lanterns. In reality, it was most likely an ordinary fisherman in a small boat, using a torch to attract fish at night, a common practice among the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. A flame reflected in the water on a moonless night could appear to hover right above the horizon. But that's boring, and dragging Christopher Columbus into every article about Bermuda is a tradition. I respect the tradition. Just think, the Admiral is in the middle of discovering the New World, and already the first unidentified object is following him around. The next category of stories, ghost ships, a classic. In 1881, the schooner Ellen Austin, sailing from London to New York, spots a drifting schooner somewhere in the Sargasso Sea. Sails intact, hull sound, no one on deck. The captain of the Ellen Austin sends a prize crew aboard to sail the derelict into port. The two vessels part in the fog. A couple of days later, they meet again, and the schooner is empty once more. The men have vanished. The captain, in horror, sends a second party. Same result. A terrifying tale, too good to abandon. And the public has indeed refused to abandon it. There is one problem. The first mention of this story appears in an American newspaper in 1906, 25 years after the supposed event, with not a single archival corroboration. It looks very much as though some editor simply invented a great story for the Sunday edition. Such is the birth of legend. But there were real catastrophes that need no embellishment. 1918. The United States Navy loses one of its largest carriers, the USS Cyclops. The ship is sailing from Brazil to Baltimore, loaded with 10,000 tons of manganese ore. The Cyclops' maximum designed cargo capacity was 8,000 tons, 2,000 extra tons, 306 people on board. The ship makes an intermediate stop in Barbados, where the captain complains about engine trouble and overloading. It departs into open water and disappears without a trace. No distress signal, no debris, no bodies. World War I was underway. Germany was sinking everything that moved. But after the war, the Germans officially stated they had not attacked the Cyclops, and they had no reason to lie by then. 306 people, without a trace. The cause of the sinking has never been officially established. No aliens required. A real grim mystery. More than 30 years pass. 1952. A man named George Sand steps onto the stage. Not the French novelist, just a coincidence. George Sand is a journalist writing for a magazine called Fate. If you're not familiar with it, Fate was the equivalent of today's most sensationalist tabloid television, except on paper. Flying saucers, psychics, and spontaneous human combustion all ran in the same stream. Sand publishes an article, Sea Mystery at Our Back Door. He is the first to sketch a rough triangle on the map where ships have vanished, and the first to use dramatic phrases like, "The clock hands creep toward the fatal mark." The audience bit, but the phenomenon still had no proper name. That came in 1964 from journalist Vincent Gaddis in a piece for the magazine Argosy. The deadly Bermuda Triangle. Gaddis, incidentally, was a reporter for third-rate newspapers, a former publicist for the Studebaker Automobile Company, and his main area of expertise was spontaneous human combustion. So this man, a specialist in people who randomly burst into flames, gave the world one of the most durable geographical names in history. The Bermuda Triangle. Has a ring to it, doesn't it? A Studebaker PR man. Remember that detail? It explains a great deal. We have a name. We have borders. We have a dozen creepy stories. Now the full-fledged myth needs only one thing, the centerpiece. And it duly arrived. December 5th, 1945. Naval Air Station, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. World War II has just ended. The men are returning to training flights. 5 Grumman, TBF, Avenger torpedo bombers are being prepared for takeoff on the flight line. Formidable machines, each weighing about 4.5 tons empty, with a 3-man crew. 14 men are scheduled for the mission that day. 15 were supposed to go. But one gunner failed to show up at the last moment. No one particularly waited for him. The flight leader is Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an extremely experienced pilot. 2,500 flight hours specifically in Avengers, a lot by any measure. He had fought in the Pacific. He had ditched in water twice, survived both times, neither his fault. In short, a man who knows what he's doing. But something was off that day. Taylor arrives 15 minutes late for the pre-flight briefing. When he appears, several people notice he seems unwell. There are witnesses who would later say he had asked the duty officer to be excused from flying the day before. He was refused. The irony is that this was not some mystical omen. After the war, many experienced pilots experienced fatigue and filed such requests. But in the context of what would happen a few hours later, this detail chills the blood. The weather for Florida is a gift. Clear skies, good visibility, moderate wind. The route is a training run. Simple, almost boring. Navigation problem number 1. Fly east, bomb a practice target on the shoals near Grand Bahama Island, then head north, then turn southwest and return to base. A triangle over the water, about 3.5 hours in the air. Fuel in the tanks for 6. A massive margin. Nothing exotic. The flight takes off at 14:10. Taylor leads the group. Everything is normal. At 15:45, when the planes should already have finished their bombing run and turned for home, a strange signal reaches the base. Another group in the air picks up radio chatter from Flight 19. Taylor's voice sounds confused. "Both my compasses are out. I don't know where we are." And this on a clear day with excellent visibility, with the coastline of Florida full of landmarks. He is offered the chance to hand command to one of his wingmen whose compasses may be functioning. Taylor is silent. He is asked to switch to an emergency frequency for clearer communication. He refuses, afraid of losing contact with the group. What follows is a geography of madness. Taylor is convinced he is flying over the Florida Keys, the chain of islands curving southwest from the tip of the Florida Peninsula. He can see land below, small islands, and decides it must be the Keys. If he were right, a heading north would take him straight to mainland Florida. But the problem is that Flight 19 is almost certainly over the Bahamas to the east, and that is an entirely different geography. North of the Florida Keys, coastline. North of the Bahamas, nothing. Open ocean for hundreds of miles. Do you see the difference? One decision, and you either land at base or you disappear into the Atlantic forever. At 17:50, one of the wingmen can take no more and shouts into the radio. It is preserved in the original transcripts. "If we just fly west, we'd get home." The pilots argue. Someone suggests turning west, following the sun. But Taylor no longer trusts anything. Not his instruments, not the advice of others. He makes the fatal decision. Fly north, then east, further into the ocean. At 1900, all contact with the aircraft is lost for good. By calculation, fuel remains for about 20 minutes. A couple of hours later, a search and rescue PBM Mariner flying boat takes off from base, a large aircraft with a crew of 13. 23 minutes after takeoff, it vanishes from radar. It too disappears. No distress call. It would later emerge that mariners had a notoriously bad habit. Their fuel lines leaked, gasoline vapors accumulated, and a single spark could blow the aircraft to pieces in midair. The crew of another plane that night reported seeing a bright flash over the search area, but no debris, no oil slick. Nothing was found. 5 days of searching, 300 vessels and aircraft combing the ocean. 0. 14 men in the Avengers, 13 in the Mariner, 27 trained military personnel, and not a single fragment recovered. Though it should be noted, an Avenger weighing 4.5 tons hitting the water at speed sinks in a couple of minutes. Finding its wreckage without precise coordinates in open ocean is a task comparable to finding a coin in a football field on a dark night. But the public needed a mystery, and a mystery is what it got. In 1991, Incidentally, treasure hunters found 5 Avengers on the seabed in that area. Sensation. They compared hull numbers. Wrong ones. Also 5 Avengers. Also lost. Also in the Bermuda Triangle. Just different ones. Can you imagine the density of air accidents? 5 aircraft of the same model on the bottom in one area. And it's not even the flight you were looking for. There's your statistics. How did the investigation end? The Navy issued a verdict. Cause undetermined. The pilots' families, especially Taylor's mother, protested furiously, insisting their son was being made a scapegoat. The command eventually relented, and the official language was changed. The causes and circumstances of the loss of the aircraft are unknown. Taylor was cleared. A clean, foggy formulation that left the door open for any interpretation. Then, in the 1970s, when the legend of the Triangle was in full bloom, the radio transcripts of Flight 19 began miraculously acquiring quotes that never existed in the original records. We can't find West. Everything looks wrong, even the ocean. Dramatic, isn't it? Pure horror film material. Atmosphere was being manufactured after the fact, and it is here that the man appears who turned that atmosphere into gold. A book, hardcover. On the cover, a black triangle against a stormy sea. Title, The Bermuda Triangle. Author, Charles Berlitz. Year, 1974. Print run, 20 million copies, translated into 30 languages. More copies than the entire population of Australia at the time. 20 million people, each paying money to be told about Atlanteans guarding their underwater territory. Quite a bestseller. Who was Charles Berlitz? The grandson of the famous linguist Maximilian Berlitz, founder of the international chain of language schools that still operates in 70 countries today. Charles was a polyglot from childhood, grew up surrounded by languages, inherited the family business. He served in intelligence, fought in Korea and Vietnam. One would expect a rational mind, a seasoned officer. But nearing retirement, Charles Berlitz dropped everything, the schools, reason, logic, and plunged headfirst into the paranormal. His central obsession, Atlantis. Berlitz was convinced that the legendary continent had sunk in the vicinity of Bermuda, and moreover, that the Atlanteans had survived. They had adapted to life underwater. They had their own cities, their own technology, and they jealously guarded their borders, pulling ships and aircraft into the deep. From the standpoint of common sense, nonsense. From the standpoint of sales, absolute genius. Berlitz's arguments were peculiar. For example, the so-called Bimini Road. In 1968, divers discovered off the coast of North Bimini Island, right in the Bermuda Triangle, a line of massive rectangular limestone blocks lying on the seabed, arranged as if the remains of an ancient paved road. Berlitz and his followers immediately declared, "Here it is, the road leading to the capital of Atlantis." In reality, geologists fairly quickly demonstrated that this was a natural formation. Limestone slabs that had fractured at right angles through geological processes. But the word Atlantis in a headline beats geology by a landslide. And then it gets wilder in a Brazilian newspaper, tucked between a story about a wife driven to a heart attack by her husband snoring. A sensational report appears. A certain Dr. Verlagmeer had discovered a giant glass pyramid on the floor of the Bermuda Triangle. A pyramid, not stone, but glass and glowing. Journalists rushed to investigate. Dr. Verlagmeer did not exist in nature. The name appears in no scientific registry anywhere. It was a hoax. But the pyramid had already taken on a life of its own, migrating from book to book. The scandals only fanned the flames. In 1974, a Wonder Woman television series hit the air with an entire episode devoted to the Bermuda Triangle. Fleetwood Mac recorded a song called Bermuda Triangle. American children played a board game called Bermuda Triangle. You roll the dice, move your plastic ships through a mysterious cloud painted right in the center of the board, and pray your piece doesn't vanish. The craze reached the Soviet Union. Television ran programs about the mysteries of Bermuda, and Vladimir Vysotsky, a man with a gift for sensing the pulse of his times, wrote his famous satirical song, a letter to the editors of a science program, supposedly composed by psychiatric patients who had been watching these shows and were now demanding that the clocks be moved forward to keep ships from disappearing. Vysotsky had captured the essence precisely. The myth of the triangle had so penetrated people's minds that it no longer mattered whether it was true or not. It had become part of culture, and it was at this peak, that same year of 1974, while Berlitz was swimming in money and fame, that a man from the other side of the barricade entered the game. Larry Kusche, an amateur pilot and librarian from Mesa, Arizona. Not a scientist, not an oceanographer, not a military historian. Simply a man accustomed to working with card catalogs and not being lazy. Kusche read Berlitz's book and said, "Something doesn't add up. I'll say more about him separately." But he was the one who did what the entire scientific world had somehow failed to do. He simply sat down and checked the facts. He went through newspaper archives. He called insurance companies. He compared dates. And he found that Berlitz's bestseller was riddled with errors, distorted dates, and outright fabrications. It turned out that the Devil's Sea near Japan, which Berlitz cited as an analogous triangle, was unknown to the Japanese themselves and had never been officially designated as anything. Stories about disappearing naval vessels turned out, upon inspection, to be stories about fishing boats caught in storms. But the most astonishing part, the exposé was published, and the triangle did not die. Why? Because the myth had already escaped the control of any one person. It had become common property. Now let's look honestly at what can actually happen in this region without Atlanteans, but with a cool head. Let's start with magnetic anomalies. Lieutenant Taylor was shouting over the radio that both his compasses had failed. Berlitz and his associates claimed that in the Bermuda Triangle, the compass needle points to true north rather than magnetic north, and that this difference of a few degrees supposedly throws pilots off. But that's not how it works. Magnetic declination, the difference between true north and magnetic north, exists everywhere on the planet, and any reasonably competent navigator knows how to apply the correction. In the Bermuda Triangle, the correction is indeed small. The agonic line, zero magnetic declination, passes right through the area. But this is a feature, not an anomaly. There is no serious evidence of a magnetic wormhole capable of spinning compasses like tops in the triangle. Though, to be fair, off the coast of Brazil, there exists the South Atlantic magnetic anomaly, where the field genuinely weakens and creates problems for satellites. But it is far away and unrelated to Bermuda. Rogue waves. Now this is serious. Imagine a calm sea, and suddenly, from nowhere, a solitary wall of water 30 meters high rises up. 30 meters. That is a 9-story building, bearing down on you at the speed of an express train. These waves are not tsunamis. Their nature is not fully understood. They arise spontaneously. Oceanographers only formally acknowledged their existence in the late 20th century, after instruments recorded one off the Norwegian Drobner oil platform. For a cargo vessel sailing overloaded, like the Cyclops, an encounter with such a wave means instantaneous capsizing and sinking in seconds. No one even has time to press the SOS button. This explains sudden and traceless losses with no distress signal. And in the Atlantic, satellite observations have shown that such waves occur more often than statistics had predicted. So this explanation holds water, pun intended. Methane hydrates, a beautiful theory, but a problematic one. On the ocean floor, there lie large quantities of frozen methane, resembling ice. If it rapidly decomposes, a giant bubble of gas rises to the surface. If a ship happens to be directly above, the water suddenly loses its density and the vessel plunges into the void. Scientists in Norway even conducted experiments, blasting air beneath a model ship, and it did sink. But when a more accurate model was built and tested with a larger vessel, it turned out that in open ocean, the stream of bubbles tends to create an upward flow of water that actually keeps a vessel afloat rather than sinking it. The effect does exist in an enclosed harbor, but in the deep open triangle, it probably doesn't apply. The story of Bruce Jernan, however, is something else entirely. December 4th, 1970. Jernan is flying his private plane from the Bahamas to Miami. He enters a strange tunnel of clouds whose walls spiral outward, as though he's being sucked into a tube. His compass rotates counterclockwise. Instruments malfunction. The plane is enveloped in an electric fog, and Jernan feels weightlessness. When he emerges from the cloud, the 90-minute flight has taken only 47 minutes. 23 minutes have simply vanished. For the record, that day, 84 sunspots were recorded, and solar wind speed was 700 kilometers per second. A serious geomagnetic storm. Jernan himself wrote a book about the experience and believes he passed through a curvature of space-time. It sounds insane, but slightly more plausible than actual time travel. I promised to return to Valentich. We still have a story about people being abducted from aircraft, and the level of strangeness there is even higher. But first, conspiracy. On Andros Island, right in the heart of the Bermuda Triangle, there has been a military installation since 1966, AUTEC, the Atlantic Undersea Test and Evaluation Center, a classified military facility where submarines, sonar systems, and detection technology are tested. Naturally, for mystery hunters, this is an underwater Area 51, where Americans test captured alien technology and carefully conceal their contacts with extraterrestrials. Epic sounding, but I'll say this. Military bases love secrecy, not because of aliens, but because of budgets and espionage. The simple existence of a top-secret test range inside the triangle, however, does add spice. And finally, the most boring and the most reliable, Lloyd's of London insurance market. If you want to understand how dangerous a particular stretch of sea truly is, ask the marine insurers. These are people who do not believe in Atlanteans, but who believe in actuarial calculations. Lloyd's does not charge a premium surcharge for vessels sailing through the Bermuda Triangle at all. For them, it is an ordinary stretch of a standard shipping route. If an anomalous number of ships were actually disappearing there, the underwriters would be the first to jack up their rates. They calculate risk to 4 decimal places, and their verdict, the danger in the triangle is no greater than in any other busy maritime corridor. So, how did we invent this monster ourselves? Let's assemble the whole puzzle. Over a century and a half, somewhere between 50 ships and 20 aircraft have disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. by conservative estimates. Sounds impressive. Now compare it with the English Channel, the North Sea, or the waters around Cape Horn. Busy maritime crossroads where losses number in the hundreds and no one raises an eyebrow. In the Bermuda Triangle, it is the same picture. Heavy traffic means more accidents, no anomaly. So why this particular triangle? Because the perfect myth-making mechanism fired on all cylinders. First, reporters described individual incidents in newspapers, crewless ships, mysterious disappearances. Then a journalist at Fate magazine added drama and sketched out a zone. Next, Gaddis, the former Studebaker PR man, invented a devastatingly catchy name, the Bermuda Triangle, simply to sell an article. Then Charles Berlitz turned the article into an Atlantis-themed bestseller. The hype of the 70s blew it all sky high. Hippies were seeking expanded consciousness. It was the age of fascination with aliens, Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Loch Ness Monster. The Bermuda Triangle fit like a glove. And then cultural inertia did the rest. Vysotsky, board games, TV series, schoolyard retellings. The myth was absorbed into the cultural code. Geography also mattered. The anomaly was not somewhere in Siberia or Antarctica. It lay right off the American coast, an hour's flight from Miami. Millions of people flew to the Bahamas on vacation. And somewhere down there, under the wing of the aircraft, floated that triangle. Fear was conveniently packaged inside a tourist brochure, and this had very real financial consequences. Bermuda and the Bahamas actively used the terrifying mystery to attract tourists. Local guides would point out to sea. Ships disappear out there. And our next diving tour, by the way, goes to the supposed Bimini Road. The hype made money, and that perhaps is the key financial thread. Berlitz profited from the book, magazines profited from circulation, the islands profited from tourists, and board game manufacturers profited from children. Everyone had a stake in keeping the fear alive, and now, as promised, Frederick Valentich, Australia, October 21st, 1978. A young pilot who had failed his commercial license exams twice, with a keen interest in ufology. He takes off over the Bass Strait, and he reports to air traffic control that he is being followed by a silvery metallic sphere with green lights. The controller asks for a description of the object. It's hovering right above me. It's definitely not an aircraft. 17 seconds of metallic scraping sounds over the radio. Silence. Valentich vanished. Many years later, in the 1980s, a Soviet ufologist, citing reliable sources, reported something extraordinary. On the Soviet-Chinese border, a capsule of unknown material had been found, and inside it was a message from Valentich himself. It turned out, apparently, that he had been abducted by extraterrestrials from the Pleiades star cluster, forced to work as a pilot on a space cargo vessel, hauling oxygen from Earth. Since oxygen is in desperately short supply in the Pleiades, the now-aged pilot sits in the cockpit of an alien ship with a cigarette in his mouth. His co-pilot is a creature with 18 eyes. Through the porthole, the violet forests of the home planet are visible. I am relating this story, you will note, in a completely deadpan tone, because it is precisely for details like these that we love urban legends. And so, the finale. Carl Sagan once said, "Why do ships and planes disappear? Because they sink in water. If trains started disappearing, now that would be interesting." Sagan was right, as always. But he hadn't accounted for one thing. People want the world to be arranged just a little more interestingly than school teaches. And the Bermuda Triangle delivered exactly that. It gave people the feeling that beyond the horizon lay something greater than just water. That mystery exists. But the most remarkable thing is that the triangle simply went out of fashion. Not because it was debunked. Kusche's expose came out in the 70s, but because people got bored with it. They moved on to Egyptian pyramids and aliens, to reptilians, to flat earth theory. The myth didn't die. It graduated to the status of a classic, preserved in those 20 million books and in a Vysotsky song. And looking back now, you realize, to create one of the most enduring legends of the 20th century, not a single genuinely paranormal event was required. All it took was a random stretch of sea with a bad reputation, a few journalists with vivid imaginations, a Studebaker PR man who coined a brilliant name, a linguist's grandson who lost his mind over Atlantis, and the human desire to believe that beyond the horizon lies something greater than just water. And that is how we invented for ourselves the most terrifying mystery in the world. Out of nothing, out of fog, a couple of yarns, and one gunner who didn't show up for work.